Hello, Geoff Manchester, Manchester Music. Welcome. In a few seconds, you're going to see an interview that I conducted with Ian Shepherd, a good friend and a mastering engineer of 20 plus years. We cover a lot of ground. We talk mostly about mastering, why it's important to care about mastering, why it's important for composers to care about mastering, compression, low end, how to make all your instruments sound like they're coming from the same room. I ask Ian some questions that you guys asked me on a couple of videos ago. We also talk about courses, and one of the courses that I was introduced to Ian with was the Home Mastering Masterclass, and he has a new course now which I've taken, which is fantastic, and it's called Home Mastering Compression and Limiting. And if you go to the description for this video, you'll see a link where you can go to the actual website. And if you type in a promo code that is vodcast into the little box there where it asks you if you have a promo or discount code, you get a little over 30% off that course. And that goes till the 20th of this month. So take advantage of that. That's an affiliate link, by the way. And there's also links in the show notes to everything we talked about, including an annotated little table of contents, so you can jump around and watch what, little bits matter to you. But I encourage you to watch the whole thing. Last thing I'll say about this interview is that it was conducted at the unholy hour of 8:30 a.m. on my side. If I appear puffy and a little bit out of it, that's why. Ian's on the other side of the Atlantic, so it was like normal, regular time hours for him. The other thing is that our Skype connection was iffy, so the audio drifts in and out. I did my best to correct things in post, but I'm only one man. It's 90 minutes long. We cover a lot of ground. Sometimes he drifts, but the points will still come across, I think. So anyway, thank you so much for watching. Here we go. I'm going to shut up and let Ian talk.
Okay, so now I'm recording and I haven't hung up on you, which is good.
Great. Okay, let's see. Let's see how we do this. These things are so stuffy. I'm just going to try and make it really simple. Ian Shepherd, welcome again to my channel. I think it's been, Skype tells me the last time you and I connected was November 2017, which feels like ages ago.
Yeah. Although not, I mean, that's a year and a half. Yeah. So it's been a while. Thank you for asking. It's great to be
here. You're welcome. So there's a couple things I think that have been put out into the world from you and the website and Meterplugs. I want to get through a couple of those things. I want to check in also on this new loudness penalty site that has also entered the world now and is getting a lot of chatter and buzz, and people are finding it useful, informative. People also have some questions about it, so maybe we can talk about that. It's this, I think it's the mastering with compression or home mastering with compression at home, or help me under. Yeah, what's the title of that close?
Home Mastering Compression.
Got it.
So that I have three things. There's Home Mastering EQ, Home Mastering Compression, which is the new one, and the Home Mastering Masterclass. EQ is a deep dive into how to use EQ when you're mastering. I mean, it's called the Home Mastering course because I think that appeals to a lot of people who are interested in the stuff that I'm putting out there. A lot of my the people I connect with and the people who read the website and listen to the podcast are potentially professionally as well, but also just for their own pleasure, mastering, in a home environment. Having said that, none of the stuff that I teach is watered down or kind of oversimplified in any way. There are people who have taken the courses who are now professional mastering engineers and who were before they took the course. And, the stuff that I teach is what I do day in, day out. The two, EQ and compression and limiting, because limiting is a type of compression. So that's kind of, the two are pretty much inseparable for me. So that's part of the same course. That's the new one. That includes my original product, which was the Mastering with Multiband Compression ebook, which I've updated somewhat. It didn't need a ton of changes, but I've kind of revised that, refreshed some of the links and things. And that's included in Home Mastering Compression. And then the other thing I do is the Home Mastering Masterclass, which is kind of a bit of a more of a bird's eye view, where you're just kind of watching me master 7 or 8 songs, one a week, and using some of these strategies, but it's not as structured and in-depth as the other two. Home Mastering Compression is the new one.
Gotcha. And by the way, I'm going to make sure that we include, notes to all this in the show notes and links and, useful information where people can find out more and stuff like that. Talk briefly about I guess maybe the latest thing from you, which is the loudnesspenalty.com website, which was developed like in conjunction with Meterplugs, or what's that collaboration like between you and Meterplugs for the loudness penalty? And first of all, what is it?
Okay, so Loudness Penalty is a website where you can go, you can drag an audio file onto the window and it will it'll measure the file, which takes 20, 30 seconds, depending how big it is. And then it will tell you how much that file probably is going to be turned down if you upload it to YouTube or Spotify or Pandora or any of the online streaming services. I say probably because the chances are you're probably mastering stuff reasonably loud, and they have these reference levels where their goal is to stop us being blasted by sudden changes in level. It really annoys anybody. You're listening to audio and suddenly it's too quiet and you can't hear it, or you crank it up to hear something quiet and then wham, something hits you in the face. So they want to make a good user experience, so they measure the loudness and they try and even it out, basically. Some of them turn things up, some of them don't. It's a bit complicated and messy, but this site will tell you exactly what each of those streaming services is going to do. I say exactly, the iTunes one is a bit of an estimate at the moment, but we are working on improving that. That's what it does. I think the other thing to say kind of right up front is that it doesn't upload the audio. All of the processing happens on your computer, because some people, they see it and they're kind of like, I'm not going to share my music with you. The music doesn't even get played. The stats get analyzed on your computer, and then the numbers get sent backwards and forwards. So it's not recorded, it's not stored, it's not monitored, any of that stuff. It's I won't say it's completely secure because I don't know what's going on everybody else's machines, but it's as secure as the computer you're currently using already is. And I guess the other thing to say about it is that, let's say it says that your music is being turned down by 4 dBs on YouTube. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to sound quieter than anything else, because everything is being turned down if it's loud. It just means it's going to sound similar. So there's no need to change the audio based on what the website tells you. It's kind of for information only. I think it's really valuable to understand what's happening, and depending what results you get back, you could take various different kinds of action that we could talk about. In terms of Meterplugs, I've been working with Ian at Meterplugs now for several years, probably 3 or 4, I guess. We've developed 2 plugins together. There's Perception, which is loudness matched A/B comparisons for your mastering chain. So you just hit bypass and you hear a loudness matched comparison, which is something that used to be a software version of something that used to be a really important part of the consoles that mastering engineers would use, and is really important for making objective decisions about the sounds, the changes that you make to the audio when you're working on it. And then the other one is called Dynameter, which gives you a representation of the dynamics of the music and helps you optimize or balance the loudness and the dynamics of the music to get the best results everywhere, but also particularly online. And the loudness penalty site is something that a mastering engineer called Chris Graham and I came up with together. I thought it was a great idea. I suggested it to Ian. He was keen to do something web-based as opposed to plugin-based, kind of as an experiment, really, just to see if people liked it. We ran with it. So what you've got now is the kind of the first version, if you like, the kind of proof of concept. And if it turns out that lots of people like it, then there's all kinds of directions we could take it. And if not, we'll kind of just sweep it under the carpet and pretend it never happened. One thing to say, by the way, while I think of it, is that I noticed you did a really cool review of the website on your channel. Thank you. I don't know whether you'd already noticed, but some of your comments we've already taken action on. So you mentioned that when you switched to a different tab in the browser, it stopped processing. We fixed that. There have been a couple of other changes as well. I can't remember what they were, but that's the idea.
It occurs to me that as you're going through all these offerings and stuff, that I haven't really stopped to introduce you. And this is probably because I've had you on the channel before. We met in
Just go back and watch the other video. It's
we've met IRL, as the kids say. But for people who don't know who you are,
briefly, although you declined to come for a beer
true.
with me, stayed with your chums at Isotope, which I wasn't offended by at all.
Then again, if you were offended, I can't tell. British people are very, close to the vest, hard to read. But yeah, I mean, we've met, we've spoken, we chat offline, but the channel, I think, since 2017 has grown a little bit. So if it's okay, maybe just like a thumbnail sketch, elevator pitch of what you've been up to in the last 20 plus years and what it is you do and where we might have heard your masters.
It really is 20 plus years, isn't it? Okay, so I've been a mastering engineer for 20 plus years. Used to work for one of the leading independent UK facilities. I went freelance in 2010, mainly to work on Blu-ray stuff. And I started the website around the same time as that. I kind of got my first hit of internet publicity talking about Death Magnetic, the Metallica album that was super loud. That kind of went viral and got me off to a good start. And then once I was kind of no longer part of the company that I used to work for, I'd realized before that there was an appetite for people to find out more about mastering and to get better at doing it themselves. So I started talking about that more and more on the website, which is productionadvice.co.uk. So I've been doing that ever since. And I have these products that I mentioned earlier to kind of for people who want to dig deeper. I mean, there's a ton of free stuff on YouTube and blog posts and all the rest of it. But if you want to know even more, then those are available. And then as I say, in the last few years, I've been producing the plugins with Meterplugs. And I run a podcast called The Mastering Show, which is available at themastering.show.com, or you can find it in iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts.
And sometimes you sleep, right?
Rarely.
And I will
Heavily.
be leaving all this stuff here in the show notes. I think it's important for me to go back to, oh boy, I better get this right. It's the home mastering compression. Did I say that right? Yes, to that class. Mm-hmm. I mean, I should mention to people watching this, I have taken the home mastering masterclass. I have listened to all the podcasts since podcast 1, and I've taken this new compression course. I think for anyone wondering why this matters to them, and I say that because a lot of people on this channel are here for composing tips and product reviews and all the rest of it. I did a video some time ago which was sort of beating the drum on this weird trend that was happening all over our industry, which was that budgets are dwindling for composers, mostly because they know that they don't really have to rent out a huge studio and scoring stage and all the rest of it, because things can be replicated rather, elegantly and realistically with MIDI. And to that end, I think that there's another thing happening, which is, we don't need, a big sound stage, but also probably we don't need someone to mix this and master this. We want to find a composer that can do everything. And I was recently talking to a friend of mine, Daniel James, who is he's sort of an online personality. He's a composer for Metal Gear Solid and a bunch of other games and stuff like that. Ride Along, a few movies too. And he was telling me, they're asking me to mix stuff now, and he's like, I always just kind of mix it as I went, but they want to, give me stuff and actually have me mix it. I'm just going how do I get started? So to this end, I think courses like the ones that you offer, and also just being on your website, is extremely valuable for the kind of economy that we're moving to, which is dumping a lot on the composer. And assuming a lot of responsibility can be shouldered by that composer. So I think it's really helpful to arm yourself and educate yourself as much as you can, so that if you are asked to master something, you probably know a little bit, or have a pretty good idea to as to where to go and get more knowledge and all the rest of it. And I know from having taken your courses that one of the great things about being involved in sort of the Ian Shepherd orbit is being on your website is that you're actually, your fingers on the pulse on this stuff. There's a lot of people offering classes. I'm sort of going on a bit of a tangent, but there are a lot of people who are sort of re-entering the internet workforce, so to speak. They've been in studios and all this stuff, and now they're trying to develop personalities online and all the rest of it, whereas you've been there since the beginning, on various loudness panels, traveling, touring, talking, and you're aware of the changes in our industry and can kind of take the best bits from this panel and that conference and bring them back to us on your website, and just give us what we need to know in order to deal with whether it's streaming services or new loudness standards or whatever. So it's a great idea to be in the orbit of what you do, and to be on the website and on the Facebook page and all that stuff. It's just a great way to keep the work that we do fresh as well. So I think that if anyone is wondering, maybe the mastering class isn't for me, or maybe the home mastering class isn't for me, I think people should at least be bookmarking, listening to the podcast, just so they can be aware of what's going on and just be one step ahead, which is, I think, what you're so good at doing.
I mean, thank you. That's really good to hear. I mean, that's what I try and do. I mean, I feel lucky these days because actually having been banging on about this stuff for so long, there's now a small army of people who keep me posted. So, I mean, I think like one of the biggest posts on my site last year was when Spotify decided to decrease their reference level that they're playing stuff back at, which I think everybody saw as a really positive step because it gives us all of these the normalization stuff, the measuring the loudness and evening it out that happens with these streaming services. The reason it's important is it gives us more freedom, right? Because if their reference level is lower, we don't have to push our stuff super loud to comply with that if we don't want to. I've got no problem with people making stuff super loud if that's the sound that they want and that's what they're going for. But the thing that I do have a problem is with where everybody feels that it's a requirement or it's necessary. So yeah, when they made that change, I think probably somebody messaged me on Facebook or emailed me within a day or two of it happening. Which is, it might appear that I spend every waking hour measuring the loudness of streaming services and kind of perusing the papers and stuff. That couldn't be further from the truth. I kind of sit there and somebody goes, "Hey, did you realize this?" And I kind of go, "Oh yeah," and I test it, and if it seems interesting, then I pass it on. So yeah, I mean, that's my goal. It's people sort of say to me, "You're crazy offering a website and a podcast and all this stuff that tell people how to do what you do. Isn't that going to lose you business?" And I mean, for me, the answer is completely the opposite. It brings me business because I think, there are different kinds of people out there. The kind of people who, I mean, you mentioned, composers who are being asked to mix and master. I have a friend whose album I mixed recently, who he's a fantastic musician and he has found his way around Logic and does a great job, recording in his little home studio. But he's just not interested. I mean, he probably is perfectly capable of mixing and mastering the stuff, but that's just not what he enjoys, playing live and writing music, and all that, and making arrangements and all that kind of stuff. He doesn't want to mix the stuff. So there's people like that who just kind of like, no, that's great. You do a fantastic job of this. Go for it. Then there's people who they want to do everything because they're just fascinated by it, right? And I mean, I'm still fascinated by it even after 20 plus years. So I completely relate to that. Those are the people really that that I'm providing the stuff for, because if they're going to do it, I want to help them do a good job of it. There'd be nothing worse than somebody spending weeks, months composing, mixing their stuff, and then because they think they should, they just slap it straight into a limiter and end up with 6 dBs of gain reduction, and the whole thing, gets crushed to death. That just kind of makes me sad. And then there's the other people in the middle who maybe come to me and want mastering, and end up deciding they want to try it themselves or take one of the courses and then go, you know what, that's fantastic, but you do it. So it kind of, I think it's a win for everybody. Which is why I do it. Yeah,
and I guess the other reason I think that what you do is valuable is just because you were, and we've spoken about this the last time we talked, but you had mentoring opportunities, and that just doesn't. Well, I don't want to generalize too much, but that option just, I don't think it's available anymore, really, in a meaningful way. You probably have to really seek it out. But I know for me, having gone through audio engineering school, it was a 1-year program, but the amount of time we spent actually mastering something was, I think, an afternoon, and then the rest of the curriculum was just devoted to, how sound behaves in a console and, psychoacoustics or whatever. So I think a lot of people do want to do a lot of stuff, or maybe just do mastering and a little bit of mixing and all the rest of it. But where we go to learn this stuff, it's becoming harder and harder to find, meaningful voices that can help people. And I think that what you do is really valuable because there's a lot of stuff on YouTube. There's a lot of stuff on, the lynda.coms and all the rest of it. But I really, I've taken the home mastering masterclass. I love it. And for me, I think I'm just I'm a bit of an audio nerd. I haven't done that much mastering, but it's just good to know this stuff. Just from an educational
That's what I was going to say. I mean, yeah, that's some of the feedback that I get is I have people who take the course who actually have no intention of mastering their own stuff, or they do have an intention of mastering, and then they take the course and they kind of go, whoa, forget it. But the interesting thing is I quite often get feedback from people saying this has been incredibly valuable for me, not necessarily because I'm going to be doing this stuff myself, but because I now understand so much more. I mean, the mentorship stuff you talked about used to be incredibly important. It used to be pretty much the only way to find out how to do what we do. But it was even rarer in mastering. I mean, even when I basically you had to get a job as a trainee mastering engineer in order to get that. And there wasn't a ton of information out there at all. So now things are improving and people have got a better handle on what mastering is and how it works. But I think also there's a lot of misconceptions. There's so many videos out there of, here's my mastering chain, and there's a list of 7, 8 plugins, multiple compressors, multiple EQs, clipping, limiting, all the rest of it. And it, the courses a lot of the time for me are just making people aware that at its heart, this stuff is really simple and can be done really minimally and should be done really minimally if possible. I think there are workflow advantages to that. There are sonic advantages to that if you can achieve it. There are times when I have a hugely complex processing chain when I'm mastering as well, but that's not where it's not where I start. I do have a preset that I call up, but it has about, 10 plus plugins in it, and all off. Right. So then they're just there because they're the ones I tend to use most often. If I want to do X, then I'll pull, this kind of thing into the chain. So then I can bring them in as necessary. But if I can get a result where all I do is just adjust the level of maybe a tiny tweak to the EQ, then I'm really happy. So I think, I think all of this stuff is worth trying to spread the word about. So whenever I can do that, I'm happy to.
And I think that for me, it's not that these courses teach you, it's not so much they teach you like how to master, because they do, but they give you context for the decisions that you might be making. It's the why, which I think is so underrepresented in online videos or whatever, even tutorials that are out there. You see people going, here's how to make your kick drum thicker. Here's how to master a dance track. But there's never the why. Here's why I'm doing this and not doing this. Here's why I'm using a compressor and I'm only using 1 band instead of 3 bands. Here's why I'm using, a minimum phase EQ over, So that's why I think these courses are really helpful, is because they give you context for the why, which if you don't understand the why you're doing something, how you're doing it is probably not that important. Knowing why helps you learn other things too, like where should I start? Well, what am I listening for? What am I hearing? Okay, now I know what I'm hearing. Now I know why I'm going to use a limiter at this particular ceiling setting, and I know why I'm not going to use saturation. I know why I might increase the gain by 4 dB before doing anything. So the why is really, really important and addressed, I think, really elegantly and well in your classes.
Good. Thank you. That's good to hear, because that's something I work really hard on. I actually, if I have any insecurity about the courses, it's a concern that people might take them and there's not a mass of content, right? There's 5 videos in each of the courses. The ebook's not that long, but that's deliberate. I'm trying to only give the stuff that is helpful and useful. So I spend a lot of time thinking about what's going into the course and the structure of it. And it's interesting because I learn stuff when I'm doing them, the EQ course, well, and the compression course. People would say to me, how do you know to do this, that, and the other? And when people originally used to ask me, I was like, I just know, it's just an instinct. I've been doing this for 15 years. I just put it on and go. But that's not helpful, right? That doesn't help anybody. So when I really started to kind of think about it, I realized, oh no, there was stuff that I was taught really early on in my career when I was being trained. I just took it as read at the time. I remember having a notebook and going, right, I do this. Okay, the VU needs to read this. That correlates to a test tone. Right, okay. I just accepted all of that stuff and went with it. And what I kind of came to realize 15, 20 years later, looking back on it and trying to explain it to people, is that I had internalized all of that stuff. So it feels like an instinct. But actually, if you go back to those principles and start from on that basis and kind of follow it through, it will help anybody, because those, they're not rules, they're kind of guidelines and, I guess, starting points and rules of thumb and strategies and all those kind of things. But if you start from those places, that gives you a foundation that you can build everything else on, and you can get to the point where you break the rules or you ignore them or whatever. So yeah, it was kind of fascinating for me they say that teaching stuff is the best way to kind of find out what you know or understand what you know. And that was absolutely my experience doing these. So yeah, I mean, the home mastering compression course, I love mind maps to figure out how I'm going to structure these things. The mind map that I had for home mastering compression was so big and complicated that when you zoomed out to see the whole thing, you couldn't read any of the text in the bubbles. They were tiny. And yeah, I mean, it took me over a year to put the course together, which kind of seems crazy, and is partly because of my workflow and all the rest of it. But it's also just because it's kind of, I start out, what do I want to get across? And hopefully, I mean, I've had great feedback. People saying things like you did means hopefully I kind of got it right and I made the right choices and explained it well.
So let's talk about this, the most recent offering, the mastering course, the compression course, excuse me. So what can I've taken the course, but if I haven't, pretend I haven't, what can I expect to learn? And how did you develop the curriculum? What went in to inform the workflows that you demonstrate, and all the rest of it? So yeah, for someone who's at the webpage now, just going up and down and going, oh, is this for me? I'm not really sure. What can they expect to learn in these 5 classes?
So I basically want to, compression in mastering is different, right? Compression in mixing, there's kind of no rules. Some of the first people to really use compression in mainstream music were the Beatles. And pretty quickly they were abusing the compression. They were doing stuff that you listen to Ringo's tom fills, and the boom after the note is louder than the thump at the beginning of the note, right? And that's partly to do with the way he's playing them and the way they ring, but it's also to do with the fact that it went through a Fairchild, that they specifically went out and bought, I think, 1 or 2 Fairchilds from America at some point and brought them back because they wanted the sound that they were hearing on some of the American things. And that's what they came up with, where, that's a compressor pumping really badly, right? So, and that's a creative decision. And for them, it was part of the compositional process. And lots of people use compression that way in mixing these days. But for me in mastering, my goal is always to be invisible. So I want stuff to sound better, but for people most of the time not to know why. I don't want them to listen and go, oh wow, listen to the amazing EQ he's put on that, or listen to that fantastic compression,
it's got the
or whatever.
shepherd sound.
I just want them to listen. Yeah, I mean, no such thing, right? I just want them to. I mean, there are some kind of tendencies in my work that you could kind of pull together, but different albums that I've mastered sound sometimes wildly different from each other, because it's all about having empathy with the material and what the artists wanted, and helping get closer to their vision, right? Not my vision. So when I'm applying processing, most of the time, there are exceptions, but most of the time I want what I'm doing to be, completely invisible, for no one to notice that it's happening. So that means there are different strategies maybe that you might use when you're mastering, when you're using compression in mastering, than you might use in mixing. And I mean, for example, one of the things I teach really early on in the course is that I always have a digital brick wall limiter at the end of the chain. Not there to impart any kind of sound, just to prevent clipping, to keep the peak levels at -1, which is what I aim for these days.
-1 dB.
All of the -1 dB for the peaks, just to prevent any possible problems when you're having it encoded for MP3 or uploading to YouTube or wherever. And it also meets the mastered for iTunes standards. So that limiter is there. What that means is that the very first thing I do when I master anything, the very first thing I do is play it and listen to it. But probably before the song is finished, I will adjust the gain, either by pushing a fader up or using a plugin on the clip, or however it's done. Doesn't really matter. I bring the gain up so that it's at the right level, at the level that I have chosen when I'm mastering things. And choosing the mastering level is a really important decision to make, and that's something I go into on the course as well. I know what I want the meters to read, how I want it to sound in my room. I have the monitoring set up here at a calibrated level. It's always the same. That's a really important rule or guideline that I would offer to anybody who's mastering. If you always have the volume on your monitoring set the same, over time you learn. You don't need to measure something. You just put it on and go, whoa, that's loud, or oh, that's quite quiet, or whatever it might be. All of those kind of insights just start coming to you for free just through that one simple step. So as soon as I put something on, I can bring the level up and hear it. Now that might mean, depending on the material, I might end up with quite a lot of limiting happening, or no limiting happening, but I'm kind of not interested in that at this stage. If there's too much limiting and I'm not liking the way that it sounds, then I will bring in the compressor and control the dynamics earlier on in the processing chain. But that's even that's a couple of steps away. The next stage is to get the EQ right. Because whenever you change the level of anything, it changes the way that we hear the EQ. I think we talked about this last time I was on the show. If you make stuff louder, we think we're hearing more bass and treble. It's a psychoacoustic thing. It just happens in our head. It's not a real effect in the world. And that's kind of the driving force behind the loudness wars. But that means there's no point in judging the EQ when something's 3 dBs too quiet, because when you turn it up by 3 dBs to get the level right, suddenly you'll feel differently about the EQ you just applied. So stage one, get the level up there. Then you can move on to the EQ. Then you can start thinking about the compression. So it's things like that. It's kind of starting with the simplest possible examples I can, and then gradually moving through. So there's a video on the difference between single band and multi-band compression and why you might want to choose those. There's a video on just using limiting with no other types of compression. I should explain that. A limiter is basically a compressor. It's just a compressor with a very high ratio and a very fast attack and release time. So it's a specific case of compression, which is why they're all included in the same course. But also, one of the key strategies I teach is how to balance. I use the compression to control some aspects of the dynamics of the signal, and I use the limiter to control the peaks and sometimes other aspects. Balancing those two things and making sure that sharing the load, deciding how much impact is the limiter going to have in this song, or maybe the limiter isn't going to have any impact and it's all going to be handled by the compressor, or whatever those decisions might be. That's another kind of key part of it. So there's a whole video just on using limiting. And then there's an introductory video where I just kind of talk through my general philosophy, the general strategies I'm going to be teaching. I talk about things like monitoring level and all the rest of it. And then the fifth video it's kind of advanced techniques. They're not particularly advanced, but I just wanted to distinguish them from, it's not like some kind of, there's no magic in any of this stuff. It's all about listening really carefully with empathy for the material and making good decisions. But there are other strategies in terms of compression that I use a lot less than I do otherwise. Like, I don't know, 80%, 90% of the time, EQ, compression, limiting, not too complicated. It's all about just balancing those three things to get a great result. But sometimes I do things like parallel compression, or manual compression, where I'm actually using automation instead of using a compressor, for example. And so there are other strategies there that people will find useful in some cases, and I tried to make it, I didn't want to get too tied up with all of the fancy stuff, because like I say, I think one of the important things I can kind of get across is about the simplicity and about the minimalism, and how powerful it can be, even though you're being minimalist about the approach. It still amazes me how much difference you can make to the impression that you have of a stereo master just by using EQ and compression and a little bit of limiting. So I don't want to get bogged down in those, but I know that people would have questions about those kind of more specialized topics. So those are included as well.
And what would you say to someone who is watching this or on your website and they say, well, I'm a composer, I'm not looking to get, a top 10 hit on Spotify or YouTube. I don't really know if, not just what you do, but I don't know if mastering is really a big deal to me. What would you say to someone who thinks they might not have much to learn from this mastering stuff, that it's more a top 40 thing, it's more a hip hop, urban, whatever thing?
I think that unfortunately is not true. Just the other day I was having a conversation with some people about library music, right? So composers writing, film score material that they wanted to submit to music libraries in the hope of that people would download them and pay them licenses fees and all the rest of it. And some of that stuff sounds great, and some of it is thrashed to within an inch of its life, like kind of as much as Skrillex or Metallica at their worst or whatever. So if that's your target market or audience, and then that could be something that's important to you. On the other hand, I just think knowledge is power. I just think understanding this stuff, the risk if you don't understand the process of mastering and what it can and can't achieve and what is good and bad practice, and why you might want to do this or not do that, whatever, the risk is that you will accidentally do something detrimental. The opportunity is that by learning about this stuff, you can make it sound better. Just to use an example, if you understand that YouTube turns things down to their reference level, loud stuff, you can do an example master of what you've been working on, test it with the loudness penalty website, find out, okay, they're going to turn it down by 4 dB, so you turn your version down by 4 dBs, then you can play it against other reference material on YouTube and see how it sounds. And if you like the way that it sounds, then you're good to go. If you find that it maybe has been turned down more, like for me personally, I'd like, if something's turned down by a couple of dBs on YouTube, I'm fairly comfortable with that. If it gets much more than that, I'm feeling like it's a wasted opportunity. As soon as I see something -4 on YouTube, I'm thinking, well, that's 4 dBs of unused peak headroom that I've got there. I at least need to do the experiment and see, okay, if I just ease everything back a bit, process a little bit less hard, and compare that version with the previous version, which one sounds better? What difference does it make? And maybe the original sounds absolutely fine, but maybe not. Unless you understand that process and kind of know your way around the subject, you're not going to be able to make an informed choice about that. So I think the other thing I would say is head over to my website, productionadvice.co.uk, click on there's a button at the top of the page, which I think says mastering. And even if you don't, then the URL is productionadvice.co.uk/mastering-basics. There's a page there of completely free resources going to a whole load of this stuff. So you can just read that for just out of interest and see if it resonates. See if there's something where you think, actually, that does apply to me, or, oh, that makes sense. That explains why this happened or didn't happen when I worked on whatever it was. Or maybe not. It's, if you're lucky and the clients you have aren't focused on mastering issues. Mastering is an opportunity to get the sound. I always say mastering is making the sound the best it can possibly be. So if you've poured your heart and soul into writing a cue or a song or whatever it is, creating a piece of music, a piece of art, I'm assuming that as well as for your own pleasure, you want other people to listen to it and go, oh, that's fantastic. If, it sounds like it's coming out of a transistor radio, a smartphone speaker, and you didn't realize, and that's because there was a fault with the speakers in your room or whatever, that's a real shame. Because when you play it to somebody or give them a CD or point them the link to download it, they're not going to be hearing what you've been working on to its best possible advantage, which is just a shame, I think. maybe you're lucky and the monitors you have are fantastically set up, or you have an amazing pair of headphones or whatever, and everything is working for you, and actually what you're doing is already the best it can possibly be. In that case, you probably don't need mastering. You don't need to think about mastering issues. Even I don't hate scaremongering. I'm not trying to kind of seem like I'm putting the fear into anybody. I just feel these things are opportunities. But the unfortunate reality is that unless it's just friends and family, who will probably be fairly forgiving about what you're doing with the music, and will just love it for what it is. If you're offering this to somebody who's in the industry, they almost certainly have an opinion about loudness, for example, and it could be they think that everything needs to be super loud, which I disagree with. But if that's their opinion, it's valuable to know that and what you can do about it. They might think that super loud is ridiculous, and they would regard that as a negative. I think it's like you say, in a world where we have to do, you have to do everything. If you're going to do that successfully, you at least need to understand it and understand the issues, and kind of have some tools, have a grip, or maybe even just know when you're out of your depth. And so you're quite happily making all of your music, and then somebody kind of has seen a link online. They go, hey, we would love to, license that from you to use as the soundtrack in our YouTube video or our movie, or, put it in a playlist or whatever it might be. Suddenly it's going to be seen by a larger audience. And then suddenly maybe you care more about all of the kind of things that we're talking about. Because I think in theory, you could do all of this as part of mixing, right? In theory, you could mix so that your music didn't need mastering. And actually, that's a pretty good goal. If you aim with every mix to get to the point where it doesn't need anything else, it's going to be perfect. That's a great aspiration to have. But the number of times I actually see that happen, I could count on the fingers of one hand. I mean, even on stuff that I mix myself, working on a rig where I master music, so I know exactly how it sounds. I mean, I personally I don't have the headspace for it. I can't be simultaneously thinking about, is that the right kick drum sound, and does it balance right with the bass, and is the panning on the backing vocals right, and thinking about the emotional impact of the song and whether it makes me want to dance or not, or cry or whatever it is, and think about how it relates to the one I mixed 3 or 4 days ago or last year that I'm going to put together with it in this playlist or this EP or whatever it is. I think it's really valuable to know, to be able to focus on, okay, these are mixing things. This is arrangement. This is balance of instruments. This is the stuff that makes the song. And it's an analogy I use. I think mastering, you could say, is like, mixing is like balancing the tracks to make a song, and mastering is like balancing the songs to make an album or a soundtrack or a playlist or a collection of a satisfying whole, something that's bigger than the sum of its parts. And I think it's really helpful to separate that bit of the process from everything else, just in terms of staying sane and being able to achieve it. So that was a really long answer.
The other reason I think this is so important is because I often get questions about, how does my website look, or how does my SoundCloud look, or would you recommend, or Squarespace or Shopify or whatever. People have this attitude when promoting themselves that the most important thing is like the visual, the website, how quickly it loads and all the rest of it. But it's so important that the audio that you're uploading sounds really good, because that is you in 4 minutes or however long it is. So why wouldn't you want to deliver the best possible audio experience for anyone who might stumble on your page? Let's say you're in Canada and someone's going to listen to it in Switzerland or wherever. Like, that is the most important thing. And I think mastering allows for, it gives you the opportunity to, like you've said before, I'm probably going to paraphrase this poorly, to make the song as good as possible. So why wouldn't you want to do that? Why wouldn't the priority be the audio and not necessarily the visuals? And I see this in film and post-production too. People just, beautiful Blackmagic cameras, or, Samsung or Panasonic GH5s, but there's no consideration for audio, which is really the story. Put the film on mute, you have no idea what's happening. So I think that when it comes to why should I master? Why should I take a course? I have a great preset. I'll just do that. It's about delivering the best possible experience, especially if your little piece of audio is essentially your CV. It's you saying, give me a job. I think we really owe it to ourselves to make the material sound as good as possible.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think something else that we might have said before, but I think it's worth saying again, is that, it's one of the reasons that people like to go to somebody else to get their music mastered. Partly because you have a different perspective. It'll be listened to on a different monitoring setup that hopefully is extremely high quality. But quite aside from anything else, it's just, even if you're mastering your own music, it's an opportunity to kind of take stock and kind of look at it as a whole and go, is this working? I mean, so when I'm mastering an album, typically you're looking at 4 to 6 hours on the audio work, which probably doesn't sound that long. But I think to some degree, the speed of it is an important part of the equation, because as near as possible, you're trying to get the first impressions. How is this going to sound if somebody hears this fresh for the first time, and react to that and make that as good as you can. You also want to balance it with the idea that people are going to listen to it over and over and over again, and get the best of both worlds for that. But I mean, just as an example, last night I was mastering compilation album. It was a bunch of students. So kind of it had kind of punk rock next to trance, EDM next to hip hop, next to metal. I mean, I love doing that kind of stuff, but it's really challenging to get all of those genres to sit next to each other satisfyingly and make something that works as a listening experience, man. So I did what I often do these days, which is I kind of got to a point last night and it was like, okay, time for some sleep. Came back to it with fresh ears this morning and just kind of checked over, did the kind of the metadata, the song titles and all the rest of it, checked the gaps. And in fact, after I had exported the production master, the DDP file, I was checking that. And at that point, I suddenly thought, is that song? It's not quite loud enough. It was just suddenly different mode of thinking, kind of the mastering had kind of worked wonders. I mean, that one song had to be, coming from audio students left to their own devices, I had to put 16 dBs of gain on one song to get it up to the same level of everybody else. There was no problem. There was no noise. Wasn't a technical, there's no problem with it. It was just recorded at super low level. So, that's one thing to the kind of thing you want to get right at the mastering stage, is just the balance between different songs. I mean, at the most fundamental level, that's, even if you only do that, you will improve things. If you just kind of go, does this song work? Does that loud song hit me hard enough? Is this one kind of soft and tender enough, but not so kind of soft that it gets lost if I'm not paying that much attention or listening in a noisy environment, those kind of decisions. So I'd been all through that process, and I'd spent upwards of 6 hours working on this album. As far as I was concerned, it was perfect, to the point where I'd run the production master and then suddenly just kind of thinking about, I think it was compressing to a zip file ready to upload to Dropbox, right, to send to the client. Yeah. And just, it kind of happened to hit this track and I was like, oh, and that different mindset. The first or second episode of the podcast is called the 3 M's of mastering. Now I'm not going to be able to remember them. It was monitoring, metering, and mindset, right? And mindset is exactly that. How do you move from mixing mode, producing, arranging mode, to this kind of more global, this is an album, this is a collection of songs, what's the big picture? Is this doing what I want emotionally, sonically, all of those kind of things? So yeah, you can tell I've been doing this for 20 plus years and I'm still not bored with it. It's something I feel really strongly about. And people who do the course say the same thing. I think it can be a real eye opener to people. So, and not necessarily even just do the course, just checking out the stuff on the website. There's 250 odd posts up there now. So there's plenty of resources there for anybody who's interested.
An empire. You built an empire of information. Okay, let's get into the loudnesspenalty.com. I'm curious. Do you think, and here comes a softball, Do you think that loudness equals quality? Go.
Not loudness, not just loudness. If
Right.
that were true, then louder would always be better.
Mm-hmm.
It is true that optimal loudness equals quality, right? I mean, we're talking about the website, loudness penalty. If you make your stuff super loud, it'll get turned down a lot. If you damage the music at any point in the process of making it super loud before you uploaded it, that's a fail, right? You would have been better to have processed it less aggressively, have it turned down less. It would still sound a similar volume when it played back, and it would sound better. But it's also true that YouTube and Tidal don't turn quiet songs up. So if you upload something too quietly, it will sound quieter in comparison to everything else. Mm-hmm. Depending on the material, if it's an acoustic guitar ballad, maybe that's not a problem. But if it's meant to be a full-on EDM or rock track, you want it to be up there with everything else so that people hear it on a level playing field, because of the effect that we talked about before, where if something's louder, it sounds brighter and bassier, which means that if it's quieter, it sounds duller and kind of weaker, right? There's less impact in the low end. You don't want the thing you've been slaving over for weeks and months to just not come across as well as it could just because it happened to be a couple of dBs too quiet. So that's a balancing act, right? You want to get it loud enough, but not too loud before you upload it. Absolutely the same thing applies musically. For me, super loud stuff is probably the bigger problem because so many people are doing it. There's overusing, limiting, saturation and compression and all the rest of it. You know, the music is just being pushed louder and louder and louder because people think that's what's needed or what people will think sound better or will sell better. All of those things are myths. There's research that just like proper peer-reviewed research that shows that none of that stuff is true. But that's just one side of it. I mean, for me, that makes the music sound worse. On the other hand, if it's too dynamic, if you haven't managed the dynamics well enough, you know, there's no use having a pop song where either the chorus is too loud to be bearable or the verse kind of disappears and loses all its energy and you're not focusing on the lyrics anymore because there was too big of a difference between the verse and the chorus. So again, you have this balance. It's like you need to control the dynamics because, you know, at the end of the day, we're recorded audio. We're creating an illusion. You know, microphones are not ears. Loudspeakers are not sound sources in the real world. There's all kinds of clever processing that happens in between the sound waves hitting our ears and hitting our brains in the real world that doesn't happen when you listen to something on earbuds or through speakers. So the goal is to try and create the perfect illusion so that doesn't matter, right? So that if you record a symphony orchestra or a rock band or whatever it is, it sounds as good or better coming out of the speakers than it would if you were in the room with them. Achieving that. So, for example, if you record a symphony orchestra with the full natural dynamic range, I have a recording like this. One of my favorite conductors is Simon Rattle, who used to be with the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra and is now I might have retired from being with the Berlin Philharmonic, but anyway, I mean, he's one of the top conductors in the world. It was a recording of Dream of Gerontius by Elgar. This recording sounds great, but if you put it on so that the soloists, when the tenor and the soprano are singing and it sounds warm and full and satisfying when they're singing quietly, when it gets to the loud stuff, it literally is painful because the dynamic range is so wide. If you then turn it down so that those sections are not painful, when it gets back to the soloist, you're like, I can't quite hear them and they sound that they're too far away. So there was an instance where because classical is an area where people tend to be very purist. You know, lots of engineers are kind of like, well, I just put the mics up and I capture the sound that's there. I want to get as close as possible to the source. This is a case where as close as possible to the source doesn't mean faithfully recording and reproducing what happened, right? It means faithfully recording and reproducing it and then listening to it and going, okay, I need to tweak that for the limitations, if you like, of a domestic recording playback situation or listening on earbuds or whatever it might be. There's more work to be done to make that illusion perfect so that you're not distracted from the music, right? Which is the goal. You want an emotional connection with with the music. So you don't want to be kind of thinking, oh, why can't I hear what he's saying? Or, why does it suddenly, sound all thin and weedy or whatever it is. So yeah, you want to get the right balance technically, but you also want to get the right balance musically and emotionally. What was the question?
Well, it was does loudness equal, or does loudness equal quality, or
right? So the answer is no. Loudness on its own doesn't equal quality. It's the perfect balance of loudness and dynamics. You want the stuff to be loud enough. You want those quiet sections to be loud enough that they still come across and connect with you emotionally. You don't want the loud sections to be too loud, but you want them to be loud enough to have the right impact to pin you to your chair or to hit you in the chest in a club or whatever it is. But loudness in itself, because at the end of the day, we have no control over it, right? Because you have a volume control. Mm-hmm. If I'm or whatever processing Skype is applying to this audio, and you apply before you upload it to YouTube, if it ends up annoying somebody, my voice, which it probably will, they'll just turn me down or mute me. We have no control over the actual loudness. It's all about the relationships. That's where the quality comes.
As you talk about this, it strikes me just how passionate you are about this. And the channel's small enough that I can name drop. I met Andy Sheps a little while ago at AES, and he's someone who just doesn't care. And I think it was a while ago. I don't know if he said it. I think he said he was like, yeah, I won the loudness wars. It was me. I won them, So I'm wondering, he seems to have this attitude of like, I just do what sounds awesome to me. I just do what sounds great to me. When and why did you decide to make loudness such a, and hopefully this isn't not offensive, but like not the wrong way, like such a preoccupation of your adult life? It seems to me that you've always held this view that dynamics and how dynamics behaves in a song is just so important. There's the dynamic range day and the website and all the following very carefully, whether it's on your own time or stuff that your followers send you, changes in loudness and all the rest of it. Why is it such a preoccupation for you? And for some professionals in the field, like Mr. Sheps, it's just like, whatever, I just do what sounds awesome. I think it sounds great, big deal, Why this divide?
Great question. For me, it's years ago, I did a talk at the AES in Mexico. I can't remember the full title that I gave the talk, but the idea of it was that levels, loudness, are fundamental at every point in the chain, right? If you don't play an acoustic guitar loudly enough to sound the way you want it to sound, it'll sound lame. If you play it too hard, it starts sounding brittle and kind of, the strings twang and kind of in ways, if that's the musical effect you want, great. But if you're just going for a kind of a nice natural kind of strummed acoustic guitar sound, you need to play it at the right loudness. Then you've got to get the loudness, the level of that in terms of the mic placement. If you put the mic too close, the mic will distort. If you have it too far away, you'll get too much of the room. Then you've got the preamp gain. Then you've got the level of it in the mix. Then you've got the level of the mix going into the mastering processing. At every stage, level is it's the most fundamental. You can't judge anything. How do you know whether the EQ on a guitar is right until it's being strummed so that the instrument speaks, so that you can hear the sound of the body and all the rest of it? How do you know whether a drummer is playing or whether a drum sound is right until the drummer is really hitting the drums as hard as he wants to get the best possible sound? So that's one aspect. Then another aspect is people just get it wrong so much. Let me think of an example. Well, the Foo Fighters album, the last Foo Fighters album, right? The first single off that, Run. I put up a blog post about it because it sounded great. It was really heavy and aggressive, and it had much better dynamics than their stuff has in the past. And I was really hopeful. I was like, oh, fantastic. They're going to, take the opportunity and use the dynamics to their maximum advantage and get a fantastic sounding album. Unfortunately, when I heard the whole album, it was kind of weird. It was a bit of a mixed bag. It almost sounds to me like it hasn't been mastered at all. There are, like on the most fundamental level, there are if I get quoted on this, I'm going to sound really critical, but it just confuses me because there are quiet songs that sound too loud for me, musically, emotionally, and then there are loud songs that don't sound quite loud enough. And then there are others that are just way too loud. It just sounds to me like maybe that final stage of how do all of these things balance together hasn't been done or hasn't worked out the way they intended for me listening to it. So, I mean, that's a kind of mainstream example. And I kind of feel like, if I'd been involved in that project, I'd have just said, well, why don't we turn this one down a couple of dBs and it's going to work better emotionally. Forget all the loudness war stuff, all the technical stuff, just in terms of what Sheps is talking about, whether it feels great or not. That song is going to feel better because it's a gentle, more ballady kind of thing if it was just reined in a little bit. And then that loud one that comes after it is going to feel better. It's going to feel more awesome because it's going to hit you harder, which is what you want. But I mean, then you get just kind of, lots of the people I talk to who have been told, mastering is to put everything through a limiter with a 6 dB threshold. That's just, is anything in music wrong? That's just so misguided, right? Yeah. Because if you put everything through the setting, you haven't achieved anything. The magic in mastering is looking at each song and its own individual merits and balancing them against each other and getting them to work as a whole. Mm-hmm. If you just apply a blanket piece of processing, that's just a fail from the beginning. And also 6 dBs of limiting, if the limiter actually gives you 6 dBs of gain reduction, that's probably a fail as well, because the chances of that sounding, one of the things I teach in the home mastering compression course is that limiting used lightly can be one of the most transparent, one of the most invisible forms of compression. Limiting overused, used too heavily, can completely destroy the sound, right? You got to get that balance right. So it just upsets me to hear albums that I otherwise would have loved that just sound terrible because that bit of the process has been mismanaged. The new Janelle Monáe album, I was really excited about that leading up to Dynamic Range Day. I was looking for great dynamic sounding stuff. I was watching it on YouTube and thinking, this sounds amazing and it's got great dynamics. Maybe this could be a potential winner. I went to listen to the album on iTunes, and the whole thing is 3 dBs louder, and it was already loud. It was already right in the sweet spot, right in that perfect balance, technically and musically for me. On YouTube, I assume that what's on iTunes is the same as the CD release. I wouldn't pay money for the CD because it's just got 3 dBs of unnecessary limiting. It just sounds constricted and kind of reined in and just not as good as it could have. So actually, that's this bizarre situation where with all the lossy compression and all of this stuff that everybody complains about, the YouTube version for me sounds better because it hasn't had that unnecessary processing done. So, and that's why I'm passionate, because it just upsets me to see what in my opinion are mistakes. Sometimes they're genuine creative decisions. I think Sheps working on Death Magnetic that we talked about before is a kind of fascinating example, because in some ways the reason that album, it was amazing because like 20,000 people signed an online petition asking for it to be remixed and remastered. The fans were that upset by the sound of it. But a big part of the sound of that is in the mix rather than in the mastering. Yes, it's super loud, but it's also super distorted. It's super dry. There's no reverb. There's all kinds of production decisions that were made that contributed to the final impact of that album. And I mean, you're right. Sheps says he won the loudness war. He's also said, I don't want to misquote him, but I'm sure I've heard him say, there may have been less loud versions. There may have been, but at the end of the day, this was the one that everybody liked. That's a genuine creative decision. The shame about it is that so many people used it as a template and have done it to a whole slew of other stuff since then, where, I would say that wasn't the right creative decision even for that album, for me personally, but that's just my taste. But for that to be done to, what's her name? The Wrecking Ball, Miley Cyrus. She's done a kind of almost folky flavored thing since Wrecking Ball. It's just brutal. Smashed. The levels on it are insane. Kylie's new, I don't know whether Kylie Minogue is as big over your side of the Atlantic. Okay, again, it's just kind of lightweight bubblegum pop. And it's just flattened by the processing, and I just, so it just bugs me. Why Shep's? It's not Shep's business really to. I think he does care. I think it's disingenuous of him to kind of claim that he doesn't care. I mean, his goal is to get something that the clients are happy with. But he's somebody who I'm pretty sure would never master his own material, right? He would basically hand off responsibility for that part of the process. So the final decision of how loud it would actually be would have been a collaboration between the mastering engineer and the band. The other stuff, the creative stuff, the use of distortion, all of those other things that went into building the sound of that was his decision. But I've also heard other recordings by him that don't have that sound. It's not like he's not. I guess he's not interested in it. I'm pretty sure that the numbers, if I showed him loudnesspenalty.com, he'd be like, who cares?
Yep.
Right. But that's different from saying it's not like he doesn't care about the way that all of these things make the music sound. And I bet if he heard one of his productions that, say, got turned down by 6 dB on YouTube compared with something else that got turned down less on YouTube and the other thing sounded better because of it, or if I could upload 2 different versions of his stuff and give him that comparison and he felt one of them sounded worse, then I think he would care. He still might not be interested in the numbers, but I imagine at that point he would want to, to dig into it and figure out what was going on and to exploit it to get the best result he can.
Well, I feel like you've already got half of that post up, right, on your Facebook page. There was a recent post about Death Magnetic, either by you or someone else on the page. So you're halfway there.
I met him at the AES as well.
Mm-hmm.
I introduced myself and I briefly kind of explained my contribution to the Death Magnetic situation. I'm hoping maybe one day to get him as a guest on the podcast. That could be interesting.
Yeah, I'd watch that. We're almost at time. I have a few questions. And these are mostly from a video that I did some time ago where I was announcing a mastering course for the YouTube channel. And I just got way too busy and started to, I used this pun earlier, I'm going to use it again, shepherd people to your website and to your offerings, your digital offerings. But there were some questions on that post that if you have just a couple more minutes, I think people would be super happy to hear you speak on. Oliver Kember writes, my biggest request is, how can I make all the instruments sound like they're in the same room, each with their own little part of it? Is it adding a reverb tail? Is it EQing? Is it compression? I want all my libraries to sound like they're all in one single room. That's it. Thank you. So is there a mastering workflow or anything that can help fit all of the instruments on the stereo bus and make them kind of give them, make sure that everyone's or matching the same dress code? Is that a mastering thing or is that more of a mixing thing?
I think it's both. I think a lot of it is about the choices of reverb, where the mics are placed, how much room sound there is in there, the arrangement, the balance of the level, the instruments next to each other. But once you get past, those are all mixing things. Once you get past that, one of the reasons for using compression, we've talked about compression a lot in terms of loudness, but there are all kinds of other reasons that you use compression in sound, particularly in mixing where you can get even more creative. But one of the ways that I use it in mastering is what you might call density, where if something is completely uncompressed, there's probably a big difference between the loudest and softest moments. You could think of that as a kind of low density sound. And as you kind of compress it and bring the loudest sections and the quieter sections closer together, it becomes more consistent. And yeah, you're kind of increasing the density, if you like, of the sound. That can help glue a mix together. That's a phrase you hear very often. Some people do it with a compressor on the mix bus when they're mixing. But quite often I will use more compression at the mastering stage, even if they've already done that. I think the other thing is that, getting the EQ right. Every so often you get a mix and you just put it up and you think, oh no, that's completely wrong. And it's just, I'm going to have to ask them to change the mix. But because very often in mastering there's very little time and people don't want to be revisiting stuff, I usually give it a go and get the best result that I can with what they have before I broach that question. And yeah, it's amazing what sometimes just, for example, a huge hump in the bass, like 100 hertz or so, can make the thing sound completely boomy. So the speakers start to crack up when you turn it up enough, and then so you turn them down to stop that because it feels weird, and then nothing else seems to work. If you get the EQ right and just gently scoop that resonance out, suddenly everything else can seem to fall into place. Quite often when I'm mastering an album, I don't know, quite often, but every so often you come across, you're just working on a song and I lose complete confidence in everything I've done. I'm like, this all just sounds wrong. What the? And then at some point I kind of realize, oh, it's this again. And what that almost always means is that the sound of the track that I'm working on is not right yet, right? Because I very commonly get to a point where I think it's right, and then I'll start flicking between the thing I'm working on and other songs on the album. If you have one thing that's not quite right in comparison, it makes everything else sound wrong. I mean, there's a great tip. It's not really a mastering tip, but if you want everything to sound like it was recorded in the same room, record everything in the same room. And if you're using virtual sounds, you could use a similar reverb on all of them, can help. Or you could maybe, some people even go so far as to play sound sources back in a real space and record the ambient sound of that. But yeah, definitely mastering can contribute to that, but I don't think it's completely a mastering issue.
Next question. I'd like to learn how to come up with a final master that sounds good on different platforms. Many times my masters sound good in my studio, but I'm often disappointed when I take them in the car or on the iPod, for instance. I find it difficult to reach good balanced sound with good dynamics. That's the question.
So two things, because this may not all be down to the dynamics. Probably more likely it's down to the EQ. One of my top tips for anybody doing anything is to make sure you listen to a ton of your favorite music in the studio, in the space where you record, mix, master your music. Because the classic thing is we do all of our listening in the car or on earbuds or in the living room. And then you have a special room, which is your, the place where you come to create. And you do that, but you have no idea how the sound in that space relates to the sound in the outside world. So the fix for that is to bring your favorite recordings from life. And you don't have to kind of sit there and listen and focus on them. My advice is just put them on fairly quietly in the background while you do other stuff, while you do email, soldering up cables, restringing a guitar, whatever it is that you're doing. Because over time, you will learn how those songs, one thing is you may kind of go, oh, wow, that sounds really weird. And it might identify a problem with your monitoring, right? Let's say there's the bass 70 hertz kind of completely cancels out at your mix position, which is pretty common especially if you have a square room and you're sitting right in the middle of that square room. All those recordings that sounded fine to you everywhere else, when you bring them in and put them on in your little studio or your recording writing space, you'll suddenly hear, well, there's no bass there, right? And so you can take steps. You could try experiment with acoustic treatment. You could try moving the monitoring, all the rest of it. That's stage one. If it basically sounds okay to you, listening to these things that sound great everywhere else in the room, then just put them on and expose yourself to them over a long period of time. And, it doesn't matter if you move around, all the rest of it. Our brains will subconsciously just add up all of this stuff, and you will learn what good sound sounds like in your space. So that's kind of one thing. Specifically talking about loudness and dynamics, since you asked the question, it's been really interesting launching the loudness penalty site. It's been up for a couple of weeks now. Had a real mixture of responses from it. There's people who are like, this is fantastic, we love this. And then quite a lot of people kind of getting annoyed about either what it tells them or what they think we expect them to do. But one of the big things that I've realized that is confusing people is just because these reference levels for online streaming exist doesn't mean you have to use them as targets, right? So Spotify and YouTube and Tidal are all roughly minus 14 LUFS loudness units. If you have a loudness unit meter and you measure them, that's roughly where they come out. That doesn't mean you should master your music to be at minus 14, partly because only Tidal actually uses loudness units, LUFS. All of the others use different ways of measuring loudness and different rules, which is why we made the website to help people out so they can see exactly what's happening. But even then, just because who cares if YouTube turns something down by 2 dBs so that it's a similar level to something else that was turned down by 3 dBs or 4 dBs, it's fine. If it sounds great to you, you're good. You don't need to change anything. Maybe you look at it and go, well, there's an opportunity there and I can do an experiment and see whether if I process it differently, it will sound better. Or maybe it'll tell you, well, it's not quite loud enough and I want to address that. There's valuable stuff to be learned. But I mean, if you think about it, it makes no sense. Why would you target a specific number? Let's say it's -14. If it's an acoustic guitar ballad, you wouldn't want that to be the same loudness musically as death metal, right? It just makes no. So if you're a death metal band who has an acoustic guitar ballad on your album, you don't want to master those things at the same level. So I put up a couple of blog posts kind of making that point really, really clear because I saw this confusion out there. And I got some kind of frustrated people saying, well, what are we supposed to do then? You banging on about loudness and levels and how important it is and all the rest of it. Now you're saying that you can't give us a target figure. So the key is not to measure the whole song. The key is to look at the loudest moments of the thing that you're working on. And the number that I would use as a rule of thumb is don't go any louder than -10 LUFS, which if you're using an RMS meter is roughly -10 RMS. Then balance everything else musically relative to that, right? So the loudest section is hitting -10. We talked about the need to get the balance between the verse and the chorus right. Flick across to the verse and think about it. And if it's not quite loud enough, bring the level up a little bit. Use a little bit of automation or more compression or whatever it is. And that, in my experience, if you follow that procedure, and there's a blog post where I go into this in a lot more detail, productionadvice.co.uk/how-loud. If you follow this procedure, you will end up, you need a balanced EQ as well, but chances are you're going to be in good shape for all of the online streaming platforms and CD, actually. Not as super loud as some of the stuff that's out there. There are people talking about doing one master for CD and one for everywhere else, which I just think makes no sense to me. There's only 17% of the US music market last year played physical product at all. So to kind of compromise what you're doing for their sake, I don't understand it. But yeah, that's my best advice. That's a kind of a rule of thumb that you can use. You don't have to go that loud, but if you follow those guidelines and then use the loudness penalty site to find out what's actually happening, you should be in good shape.
Great. Those are the only two standout questions I think that hadn't been addressed elsewhere on my channel or in some Reddit stuff that I posted where I invited people to ask you questions. I'm going to do my best to put everything that we talked about that has some sort of article out there, or blog post or website in the show notes. So please look in the description if you want to find out more. And the great thing is that most of the stuff that we're talking about today is free. It's articles, it's Facebook posts, it's the loudnesspenalty.com, it's
videos,
YouTube. It's all out there for free. But if you do decide to take the courses, they're great. And, well, I think they're great. And I actually took them. It's like, sometimes when a late night talk show host brings out a guest and goes, it's a great new book, I just read it. Like, there's no way they read it. I've taken the courses. And they're wonderful, I think. So, anything else, Ian? Any final thoughts or stray thoughts or endorsements? Anything you want to talk about before we sign off?
No, I want to say thank you for inviting me on the show and, for doing what you do. It's great to have people like you who care about, because, you're asking me all these questions. I know you know half of the answers already. And I think that's so important that more people start talking about this stuff. I'm possibly excessively passionate about these topics. And I do sometimes wonder about the XKCD cartoon, the one of like, are you coming to bed? Wait, there's somebody who's wrong on the internet. That's definitely me sometimes. But, I do think, and I'm sure that the people who are watching this and listening to this, also care about that stuff. So, yeah, thank you for helping spread the word and inviting me on the show. If anybody wants to connect with me on social media, it's at Ian Shepherd, PHERD, like the ones with sheep, on Twitter. And I'm pretty sure if you search for that on Facebook, you'll find me fairly easily. as well. Yeah, I always like to chat to people. You're welcome to email me as well. There are contact details on the website. Hands up, I can't cope with the volume of email I get these days. So there's a good chance you'll just get an autoresponder reply and never hear from me again. But I do read all the emails that come in, and I do pay attention to them. It's one of the places I figure out what I'm going to do in terms of new videos and new content in future. So I always like to hear from people. So you do get in touch.
All right. Thank you very much, Ian Shepherd, for being on the show. It's not a vodcast because I can't, I can drink at 8:30 in the morning, but I don't want to brag about it.
Yeah, 1 p.m. is a bit early in the day for me as well.
Unless you've just been reading your email and checking your Facebook messages about the loudnesspenalty.com site. Then it's time for a drink. I
just want to say thank you, by the way, for the opportunity to do one of these in daylight. So often when I'm talking to people on your side of the Atlantic, it's like getting on for midnight for me. So it's nice to be doing this when I'm kind of reasonably awake.
That's how I like my guests, reasonably awake. Okay, yes, thank you very much, Ian. Take care.
My pleasure. Thanks.